On a remote shoreline where the Caribbean meets the unknown, a discovery is about to change everything. When Captain Blackheart's young daughter finds a mysterious woman frozen in ice, washed ashore after a violent storm, the hardened pirate crew expects nothing more than another casualty of the sea. They couldn't be more wrong. The woman awakens from what should have been certain death, her first words striking terror into the hearts of men who fear nothing. What she reveals ties directly to the captain's buried past, an ancient curse that has followed him across the seven seas. But can a child's love break ancient curses? The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered deck of the Crimson Revenge, where 8-year-old Isabel Blackheart sat cross-legged, carefully arranging her collection of coral shells. Each piece told a story, she believed. The pink one with spiraled ridges came from the lagoon where Papa first taught her to swim. The deep purple specimen, smooth as polished glass, had tumbled from a cliff during their adventure in the Windward Isles. "Tell me again about the shell that sings," she called to her father, who stood at the helm with the easy confidence of a man who had commanded the seas for 20 years. Captain Magnus Blackheart turned from studying the horizon, his weathered face softening as it always did when he looked upon his daughter. Where others saw the notorious pirate whose very name struck fear into merchant vessels across the Caribbean, Isabel saw simply Papa, a man who braided her hair each morning, who sang old sea shanties in a surprisingly gentle voice, and who never failed to listen when she shared her dreams and discoveries. "The silver one there," he said, pointing to a delicate shell that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. "Found that one myself, years before you were born. Hold it to your ear on quiet nights, and you can hear the ocean's memory." Isabel picked up the shell reverently. She had tried many times to hear its song, but Papa insisted it would speak to her when she was ready. Everything in Papa's world had its proper time and season, a wisdom she was only beginning to understand. The crew of the Crimson Revenge moved about their morning duties with practiced efficiency. These weren't the bloodthirsty cutthroats of tavern tales, but rather a brotherhood of men who had found purpose and family under Captain Blackheart's command. They treated Isabel with a mixture of protective affection and respectful deference, understanding that she was both the captain's greatest treasure and his most vulnerable point. "Morning, little miss," called out First Mate Sullivan, a grizzled Irishman whose loyalty to the captain was absolute. Despite missing his left hand to a shark attack 3 years prior, he remained the finest sailor Isabel had ever known. "Found something special on your beach walk, did you?" Isabel's eyes sparkled with excitement as she remembered her dawn discovery. "Oh, Mr. Sullivan, you won't believe what I found. There's a lady made of ice down on the shore. She looks like she's sleeping, but she's all frozen up like winter came to visit our island." The crew's chatter gradually died away as Isabel's words carried across the deck. Sullivan exchanged a meaningful glance with Papa, his face growing serious. In their world, the unusual often meant danger, and they had learned to trust the child's observations. Her innocent eyes often saw things that their hardened perspectives missed. "Show me," Captain Blackheart said simply, already moving toward the gangplank. His daughter's adventures rarely proved mundane, and something in her tone suggested this discovery might be significant indeed. As they made their way down to the secluded cove that served as their temporary harbor, Isabel chattered about the storm that had raged the previous night. She had watched from her cabin window as lightning split the sky and enormous waves crashed against their protected inlet. Papa had assured her that their ship was safe, anchored in the natural harbor he had chosen specifically for such storms. The island itself was a perfect hideaway, known only to a handful of pirates and completely absent from any official charts. Fresh water flowed from mountain springs, fruit trees provided sustenance, and the natural barriers made detection nearly impossible. It had been their haven for 3 months now, the longest they had stayed anywhere since Isabel could remember. "Papa," she said as they approached the shoreline, "why do we never stay anywhere very long? I like it here. The water is warm and the fish are friendly, and I found a family of hermit crabs that I've been teaching to race." Captain Blackheart's step faltered slightly. How could he explain to his innocent daughter that they were constantly running? that his past cast shadows long enough to darken any place they might call home, that every port held the potential for recognition, capture, and separation. "Sometimes, little one," he said carefully, "the sea calls us to new adventures. A pirate's life is about freedom, about seeing all the wonders the world has to offer." It was a partial truth, the kind of gentle deception that parents use to protect their children from harsh realities. But as they crested the small dune that overlooked the cove, Captain Blackheart wondered if their running was finally about to catch up with them. There, exactly as Isabel had described, lay a woman encased in what appeared to be crystal-clear ice. The sight defied every law of nature he understood and sent a chill through his experienced sailor's heart that had nothing to do with the temperature. The crew gathered around the impossible sight in stunned silence, their weathered faces reflecting a mixture of awe and unease. Captain Blackheart knelt beside the frozen woman, his analytical mind struggling to comprehend what his eyes clearly showed him. The ice was perfectly clear, unmarked by the salt and debris that should have accumulated during her journey to shore. More disturbing still, he could see the gentle rise and fall of her chest beneath the crystalline shell. "Captain," Sullivan whispered, his voice tight with superstition, "we should leave her be. Nothing good comes from meddling with the supernatural." Old Henrik, the crew's healer and the closest thing they had to a wise man, shuffled forward with his leather satchel of remedies and curious implements. His pale blue eyes, clouded with age but sharp with accumulated wisdom, studied the frozen woman with professional interest. "In 40 years of sailing these waters," Henrik murmured, "I've seen many impossible things. This lady, she's not dead. Something or someone has preserved her for a purpose." He reached into his satchel and withdrew 3 smooth stones, each about the size of a man's fist. They appeared ordinary enough, dark grey river rocks worn smooth by countless years of tumbling in mountain streams. "What are those, Henrik?" Isabel asked, her natural curiosity overcoming any fear she might have felt. She had always been drawn to Henrik's mysterious collection of healing tools and ancient remedies. "Warming stones," Henrik replied, his gnarled hands cradling the rocks with reverent care. "Found these in a sacred cave in the Northern Islands many years before you were born. The native healers there use them to draw out deep cold, the kind that settles in a person's bones and refuses to leave." He paused, studying the frozen woman more closely. "But I've never used them for anything quite like this." As Henrik arranged the stones around the woman's ice-encased form, something extraordinary began to happen. The stones started to emit a soft, warm glow, as if lit from within by some ancient fire. The glow pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and the air around them shimmered with waves of heat that seemed to dance with purpose rather than simply radiating outward. "By all the saints," breathed Sullivan, crossing himself reflexively. Several other crew members followed suit, their Catholic upbringing surfacing despite years of piratical skepticism. The ice began to respond to the stone's influence, but not in the way natural ice should melt. Instead of simply turning to water, it seemed to evaporate into mist that spiraled upward in delicate, almost artistic patterns. The process was beautiful and unnerving in equal measure, as if nature itself was participating in some ancient ritual. Captain Blackheart found himself torn between his practical nature and the evidence of his own eyes. As a man who had spent his life mastering the predictable dangers of the sea, he was deeply uncomfortable with forces that operated beyond his understanding or control. Yet he could not deny what he witnessed, nor could he ignore the strange sense of familiarity that nagged at the edges of his consciousness. "Papa," Isabel whispered, taking his large, scarred hand in her small, soft one. "She's beautiful, like the ice princess from the stories you tell me." Indeed, as more of the woman became visible through the thinning ice, her ethereal beauty was undeniable. Her hair was the color of spun gold, her features delicate but strong, suggesting both nobility and resilience. She appeared to be perhaps 30 years of age, though something about her seemed timeless, as if age was a concept that applied differently to her than to ordinary mortals. The warming stones continued their work with supernatural efficiency. Henrik watched them with growing amazement, for they had never glowed so brightly or worked so purposefully in all his years of using them. It was as if they recognized the woman, and were eager to serve her specifically. "Captain," Henrik said quietly, "these stones, they're responding to her in ways I've never seen. This is no ordinary person we're dealing with. She carries some power within her, something that calls to the old magic." As the last of the ice melted away, the woman lay on the sand as if merely sleeping. Her clothing was strange, neither modern nor entirely ancient, but rather timeless in its simple elegance. Around her neck hung a tarnished silver locket, intricate in design and clearly very old. The warming stones gradually dimmed, their work complete, but they continued to radiate a gentle heat that seemed to encourage life to return to the mysterious stranger. The crew stood in absolute silence, waiting to see whether they had rescued a living person or merely prepared a beautiful corpse for burial. The tension stretched taut as a ship's rigging in a storm, broken only by the gentle sound of waves lapping at the shore, and Isabel's quiet, steady breathing as she kept vigil beside the woman who had appeared from nowhere. The woman's eyes snapped open with the suddenness of lightning striking clear skies. They were the color of storm clouds, grey-green and filled with an urgency that sent shivers through every man present. Her chest heaved as she drew great gasping breaths, as if she had been holding them for an eternity. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of desperate prophecy. "Magnus," she whispered, and the single word hit Captain Blackheart like a cannonball to the chest. "The children are dying." The captain staggered backward, as if physically struck, his face draining of all color. In 20 years of piracy, his crew had never seen their fearless leader show such raw, naked terror. His hands trembled as he stared down at the woman who had just spoken a name that no living soul should know. "Impossible," he breathed. But even as he said it, the compass at his belt began to behave strangely. The instrument, broken for as long as anyone could remember, suddenly sprang to life. Its needle spun wildly before settling on a direction that pointed neither to magnetic north nor to any earthly destination. Instead, it seemed to point towards something beyond the physical world, something that called to it with inexorable force. The woman struggled to sit up, her movements graceful despite her obvious disorientation. When her storm-colored eyes fixed on Captain Blackheart's face, recognition dawned in them like sunrise over troubled waters. "You haven't changed, Magnus Thorn," she said, and with those words she shattered the carefully constructed identity he had built over 2 decades. Still running from the truth, still believing distance can save you from what follows in your wake. Sullivan stepped protectively closer to his captain, his weathered hand moving instinctively to the cutlass at his side. "Who are you, woman? How do you know the captain? Know him?" The woman's laugh held no humor, only infinite sadness. "I knew him before he became Captain Blackheart. I knew him when he was Lieutenant Magnus Thorn of His Majesty's Navy, when he had a wife named Sarah and dreams of growing old by the sea." Her voice grew softer, more urgent. "I knew him before the plague took everything he loved and sent him fleeing into the arms of piracy." The crew exchanged shocked glances. Their captain's past was a mystery to all of them, a subject never discussed and carefully avoided. To hear it laid bare by this strange woman was like watching their world turn upside down. "Papa?" Isabel's small voice cut through the tension like a blade. She looked between her father and the mysterious woman with the confusion of a child trying to understand adult complexities. "Who is Magnus? Is that your real name?" Captain Blackheart knelt beside his daughter, his large hands shaking as he touched her face. "Isabel, my darling, there are things about Papa's life before you were born that are very complicated. Magnus Thorn was who I used to be, a long time ago. The children, Magnus," the woman continued, her voice growing more urgent. "It's happening again. The same plague that took your family, it's spreading through the coastal towns. Innocent children are dying, and you're the only one who can stop it." "That's impossible," Captain Blackheart said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The plague died out 20 years ago. I've stayed away from the settlements, away from anywhere it could touch. You think distance matters to a curse?" The woman fixed him with an intense stare. "You think the sea can wash away blood debts and supernatural judgment? The plague never died, Magnus. It simply grew stronger while you ran, and now it's claiming children who weren't even born when it first took your wife. The broken compass at the captain's belt began spinning more frantically, its needle searching for something beyond their understanding. Around them, the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural tension, as if unseen forces were gathering in response to the woman's words. "What are you?" Sullivan demanded, his superstitious nature fully aroused. "Are you some kind of witch or spirit sent to torment us?" "I'm someone who loved this man's family," the woman replied simply. "Someone who watched them die and vowed that their deaths would not be meaningless." She turned back to Captain Blackheart. "I'm Elena, Magnus, Sarah's sister, and I've been waiting 20 years for the chance to find you and bring you home to face what you left behind." The revelation hit the captain like a hurricane. Elena, Sarah's younger sister, who had been barely 18 when the plague struck their coastal town. He had thought her dead, had assumed the disease had claimed everyone he had known and loved. But even as understanding dawned in his eyes, Elena's strength seemed to fail her. The effort of awakening and delivering her desperate message had drained whatever supernatural force had sustained her. Her eyes fluttered closed, and she collapsed back onto the sand, leaving the stunned pirates with questions that burned like brands in their minds. Captain Blackheart retreated to his quarters with the unsteady gait of a man who had taken a mortal blow. His hands shook as he closed the heavy oak door behind him, shutting out the concerned faces of his crew and the innocent questions in his daughter's eyes. For 20 years, he had successfully buried the man he used to be beneath layers of carefully constructed legend and willful forgetfulness. Now, with a few words from a ghost made flesh, those walls had crumbled like sand castles before a tsunami. His cabin, usually a refuge of order and control, felt alien to him now. The charts on his desk seemed to mock him with their careful notations of safe harbors and profitable trade routes. What good were maps when the past could reach across decades to drag him home? What value was navigation when he had been sailing in circles all along? With trembling fingers, he moved to a loose floorboard beneath his bunk. The hiding place had gone undisturbed for so long that the wood protested as he pried it up. Beneath lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless handling in years long past. He had not opened this book since the night he had decided to become Captain Blackheart, but his hands remembered its weight and texture as if it were yesterday. The first entry was dated 22 years ago, written in the careful hand of Lieutenant Magnus Thorne, aged 26 and full of hope for the future. "Today I married the most beautiful woman in all the Caribbean. Sarah Elizabeth McKenna became Sarah Elizabeth Thorne before God and all our friends. I am the luckiest man alive." The words, written in fading ink, seemed to glow with remembered joy even as they pierced his heart like daggers. He turned the pages slowly, each entry a window into the life he had lost. There was Sarah's pregnancy, their shared excitement over the coming child, the joy of their son's birth. Michael Thorne, born on a bright spring morning when the world seemed full of limitless possibility. Magnus had been certain he would teach the boy to sail, to navigate by the stars, to serve king and country with honor and dignity. The entries grew shorter as his naval duties increased. Promotion to port commander had brought responsibility and respect, but also long hours away from his growing family. Sarah never complained, but he could read between the lines of his own writing the gradual erosion of their time together. He had been building a career, a legacy, a future for his son. How was he to know that future would be stolen before it could begin? Then came the entries he dreaded most, the ones that chronicled the plague's arrival in their peaceful coastal town. At first it had seemed like any other disease, children falling ill, running fevers, recovering within a few days. But this sickness was different. It lingered, growing stronger rather than weaker, and it seemed to target the young with malicious precision. "Sarah is worried about Michael," he had written. "The boy has been listless for 3 days, refusing to eat. Dr. Morrison says it's likely the same fever that's been affecting other children, but Sarah fears something more serious. I've arranged for the best physician in Kingston to examine him tomorrow." But tomorrow had brought only worse news. Michael's fever had spiked dangerously high, and he had begun speaking of strange dreams, dark visions that terrified him. Other children in the town were experiencing similar symptoms. Some had already died, and their deaths were unlike anything the local doctors had ever seen. The final entries were written in increasingly desperate handwriting, as if his pen could barely keep pace with his racing thoughts and breaking heart. Sarah had fallen ill while caring for Michael, and then both of them were gone within days of each other. The plague took his wife and son with the efficient brutality of warfare, leaving him alone in a house that had once rung with laughter and love. A soft knock at his door interrupted his painful journey through memory. "Papa?" Isabel's voice was small and uncertain. "Are you sad? You looked sad when the ice lady said those words." He closed the journal carefully and rose to open the door. His daughter stood in the hallway, her coral shell collection clutched in her small hands like an offering of comfort. "I am sad, little one," he admitted, pulling her into his arms. "Sometimes the past comes back to visit us, and it brings difficult memories." "The ice lady knew your other name," Isabel said thoughtfully. "Do you think she's here to help us remember something important?" When Elena awakened for the second time, she did so with more grace and less urgency. The supernatural shock that had accompanied her first words had given way to a profound weariness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. Henrik had moved her to the ship's medical quarters, where she lay propped against soft pillows, her golden hair spread across white linen like spilled sunlight. Isabel sat nearby, having appointed herself as the mysterious woman's guardian and companion. The child's presence seemed to calm Elena in a way that surprised everyone, including Captain Blackheart, who watched from the doorway with a mixture of wariness and growing recognition. "You want to know my story?" Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of impossible years. Her fingers moved unconsciously to the pendant at her throat, a strange crystalline droplet that seemed to capture and hold the lamplight in its depths. "I suppose I owe you that much, considering how I've disrupted your peaceful morning." "You said you were Sarah's sister," the captain said, stepping closer but maintaining a careful distance. "Elena McKenna. You would have been 18 when the plague struck Thornhaven." "I was 19, actually," Elena replied with a sad smile. "But then, time has a way of becoming fluid when you're caught between worlds." She held up the pendant, and it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "This was the last tear I shed for my sister and her family. It crystallized as I wept, becoming something more than mere salt and sorrow." Sullivan shifted uncomfortably in the corner, his weathered features creased with suspicion. "Begging your pardon, miss, but tears don't turn to crystal, and people don't sleep in ice for 20 years without aging." "You're asking us to believe in fairy tales." Elena's laugh was like silver bells touched by winter wind. "Fairy tales, Mr. Sullivan. In a world where warming stones glow with ancient power and compasses point toward supernatural destinations, perhaps you should expand your definition of what's possible." "Tell us what happened," Isabel said softly, her young voice cutting through the adult skepticism with the simple acceptance of childhood. "Tell us why you were sleeping in the ice." Elena's expression softened as she looked at the child. "You have your father's courage, little one, but your heart is far more open than his ever was." She settled back against the pillows, her fingers still caressing the crystalline pendant. "Very well. Let me tell you about the night the world changed forever. The plague that struck Thornhaven was not a natural disease," Elena began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a well-remembered nightmare. "It was summoned by a woman named Morwen, a healer who had been wronged by the town's leaders and sought terrible revenge. Your family, Magnus, was specifically targeted because you had served on the council that banished her for practicing what they called dark arts." Captain Blackheart's face went white. The woman who poisoned the wells, but she was mad, driven out before any real harm could be done. "Before any harm to adults could be done," Elena corrected. "But Morwen's curse was specifically designed to target children, the innocent souls who had no part in her banishment. She wanted the guilty to suffer by watching their loved ones die." The pendant at Elena's throat began to glow more brightly as she continued. The night Sarah and Michael died, I went to confront Morwen at her hideaway in the sea caves beyond the harbor. I was young and foolish and believed that love could overcome any evil. I was wrong, but my sacrifice saved others. What kind of sacrifice? Isabel asked, her eyes wide with fascination rather than fear. I challenged her to take me instead of the remaining children, Elena said simply. But Morwen was clever. She didn't kill me. Instead, she froze me in time, suspended between life and death, forced to watch as her curse spread beyond Thornhaven to other coastal settlements. She wanted me to witness the ongoing horror, to know that my sacrifice had been meaningless. But you're here now, the captain said, his voice hoarse with emotion. You escaped somehow. Elena nodded, her grip tightening on the pendant. 20 years of supernatural imprisonment gave me certain insights. I learned that Morwen's curse was powered by the guilt and fear of those who escaped it. The more they ran, the stronger it became. That's why it has been spreading, Magnus. Your flight has been feeding it all these years. The room fell silent, except for the gentle creaking of the ship and the distant sound of waves against the hull. Elena's words hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, marking the end of one understanding and the beginning of something far more frightening. Elena rose from her bed with surprising strength, her movements purposeful despite the ordeal she had endured. From the folds of her strange, timeless dress, she withdrew a rolled parchment that seemed far too large to have been concealed there. The map was ancient beyond measure, its edges brown with age and its surface marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight. "This is the map of Sorrow's Wake," she said, spreading it carefully across the small table in the medical quarters. Morwen created it to track the progress of her curse as it spread from town to town, child to child. The map showed the entire Caribbean, but it was unlike any chart Captain Blackheart had ever seen. Instead of normal navigational markings, the coastlines were traced with what appeared to be dried blood. Dark stains marked various settlements, each one accompanied by numbers that seemed to shift when viewed directly. "These marks," Elena continued, pointing to the stains, "represent the places where the curse has taken hold. The numbers show how many children have died in each location." Her finger traced a path that began in Thornhaven and spread outward like a poison through the trade routes. "See how it follows the patterns of commerce and travel? The curse spreads wherever people flee from it, carried in their fear and guilt." Isabel leaned closer to examine the map, her young eyes untroubled by the supernatural elements that made the adults uncomfortable. "Papa, look here," she said, pointing to a cluster of marks near their current location. "It's getting closer to us." Captain Blackheart studied the map with growing horror. The pattern was unmistakable. Every port where he had stopped, every island where they had sheltered, showed the telltale stains of the curse's passage. He had not been running from his past. He had been carrying it with him, like a plague ship spreading disease wherever it anchored. "This is impossible," he whispered. "I've stayed away from settled areas. I've avoided contact with families, with children. The curse doesn't require direct contact," Elena explained, her voice heavy with sorrow. "It follows bloodlines, connections, and guilt. Every time you've taken supplies from a fishing village, every time a crew member has visited family in port, you've created a link. The curse travels those links like lightning through metal." Sullivan, who had been studying the map with increasing agitation, suddenly pointed to a small island near the eastern edge. "That's Turtle Bay. My sister lives there with her children." His weathered face went pale. "I sent them money just 2 months ago through a merchant vessel, and that connection was enough," Elena said sadly. "The curse doesn't distinguish between intentional and accidental contact. It simply spreads, following every thread that connects you to the innocent." Henrik, who had been examining the map with his healer's eye, made a disturbing observation. "The dates here, they're recent. This curse, it's not something that happened 20 years ago and faded away. It's still active, still spreading." Elena nodded grimly. "Morwen designed it to be self-perpetuating. As long as Magnus remains alive and continues to run from his responsibility, the curse grows stronger. Every child that dies feeds it more power, allows it to reach further, claim more victims. What responsibility?" Captain Blackheart demanded, though his voice carried the weight of a man who suspected he already knew the answer. "What could I have done differently?" "You could have stayed," Elena said simply. "You could have faced the curse when it was young and weak, when Morwen was still merely a bitter woman seeking revenge. Instead, you fled, and your fear became the curse's strength." She pointed to markings on the map that showed the curse's evolution over time. "See how it has changed? What began as simple revenge against Thornhaven's council has become something far more terrible. The curse now has a life of its own, seeking out the descendants of anyone connected to the original banishment." Descendants? The word hit Captain Blackheart like a physical blow. Elena's eyes found Isabel, who was still studying the map with innocent fascination. "The curse is specifically designed to target the children of those who wronged Morwen. It can sense bloodlines across generations. That's why it's growing stronger as it approaches you, Magnus. It knows you have a daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Every man in the room understood the implication instantly. They had not been sheltering an innocent child from the dangers of pirate life. They had been carrying a target for supernatural vengeance. "But there's hope," Elena continued quickly, seeing the despair in the captain's eyes. "Morwen's curse has a weakness. It was created by human emotion, powered by guilt and fear. That means it can be broken by their opposites, courage and redemption." She rolled up the map carefully, its terrible knowledge contained but not forgotten. "The curse can be ended, but only if you're willing to face what you've been running from all these years." The news of the curse spread through the crew of the Crimson Revenge like wildfire through dry timber. Men who had faced storms, naval battles, and hostile ports with unwavering courage now found themselves grappling with an enemy they could neither see nor fight with conventional weapons. The supernatural nature of their situation divided them in ways that ordinary danger never could. First Mate Sullivan stood at the ship's rail, his weathered fingers unconsciously working the leather cord around his neck. The Kraken's tooth necklace had been his lucky charm for 15 years, a massive ivory fang taken from the legendary sea beast that had nearly claimed his hand. The tooth was said to protect sailors from supernatural threats, but now, as he thought about his sister and her children in Turtle Bay, the ancient ivory felt brittle against his skin. A hairline crack had appeared down its center. Sullivan called Tobias Fletcher, the ship's quartermaster and a man known for his practical nature. "We need to talk. The men are getting restless." Sullivan turned to find nearly half the crew gathered behind Fletcher, their faces grim with worry and determination. These were good men, loyal sailors who had followed Captain Blackheart through countless adventures, but fear had a way of eroding even the strongest bonds. "Speak your mind, Tobias," Sullivan said, though he suspected he already knew what was coming. "We've been talking it over," Fletcher began, his voice steady but resolute. "This curse business, this supernatural nonsense. The men think we should put the woman ashore and sail as far from here as possible, let someone else deal with ancient evils and vengeful spirits. And abandon the captain?" Sullivan's voice carried a dangerous edge. "After everything he's done for us, after all the times he's stood between us and the gallows, the captain's got himself caught up in something that started long before any of us signed on," Fletcher replied. "We didn't agree to fight ghosts and curses when we took his coin. We signed on for honest piracy, not supernatural warfare." Young Tommy Brennan, barely 18 and the newest member of the crew, stepped forward nervously. "Mr. Sullivan, my ma lives in Port Royal. If this curse thing is real, if it's spreading like that woman says, then my little brothers might be in danger because of me being here." The crack in Sullivan's necklace spread a little wider. "And what about little Isabel?" demanded Henrik from across the deck. The old healer's eyes blazed with righteous anger. "Would you abandon that innocent child to face supernatural danger alone? Have you forgotten that she's part of this crew too?" "That's just the point," Fletcher shot back. "Child's the reason the curse is getting stronger. The woman said so herself. As long as she's with us, we're all targets. Maybe if we separate, the captain and his daughter can deal with their family curse without dragging the rest of us down with them." The deck fell silent except for the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. Men who had shared dangers and treasures for years found themselves divided by forces beyond their understanding. Some nodded agreement with Fletcher's words, while others looked ashamed at the suggestion of abandoning their captain in his darkest hour. From the captain's quarters came the sound of muffled conversation. Through the open door, they could see Captain Blackheart deep in discussion with Elena, their voices too low to make out words, but their expressions grave with purpose. Isabel sat nearby, her coral shell collection spread before her as she seemed to contemplate mysteries beyond her years. "Look at him," Fletcher continued, gesturing toward the captain. "When has he ever looked so lost, so frightened? This curse has already defeated him, Sullivan. He's not the same man who built this crew, who made us into something more than common cutthroats." But Henrik shook his head vigorously. "That's where you're wrong, Fletcher. The captain isn't defeated. He's remembering who he used to be before he became Captain Blackheart. The curse isn't his weakness, it's his chance at redemption. Redemption doesn't put food on the table or keep the Royal Navy off our backs," Fletcher replied. "We're pirates, not heroes from children's stories." Sullivan felt the crack in his necklace widen further, and he realized it was more than just supernatural pressure causing the damage. His own doubt, his own fear for his family's safety was weakening the protective charm. If even magical talismans could be eroded by uncertainty, what hope did ordinary men have against such forces? "We stick together," Sullivan said finally, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "That's what crews do. We follow our captain, and we protect our own. If that means fighting supernatural enemies, then that's what we do." But even as he spoke the words, Sullivan could feel the division spreading through the crew like the curse itself, threatening to tear apart the brotherhood they had built over years of shared danger and mutual trust. In the quiet sanctuary of the ship's medical quarters, an unexpected friendship began to bloom between the most unlikely of companions. Elena, ancient beyond her apparent years and carrying the weight of supernatural knowledge, found herself drawn to Isabel's innocent wisdom and unshakable faith in the goodness of others. The child, in turn, seemed to understand instinctively that the mysterious woman needed healing that went far beyond Henrik's herbs and warming stones. "Your shells are beautiful," Elena said softly, watching as Isabel carefully arranged her coral collection on a small table beside the bed. "Each one tells a story, doesn't it?" Isabel nodded eagerly. "This pink one came from the place where Papa taught me to swim, and this purple one fell from a cliff during a storm, but it wasn't broken because the sea caught it gently." She picked up a particularly smooth specimen, its surface worn to pearlescent perfection. "This one is my favorite. Papa says it holds the ocean's memory." Elena's eyes brightened with genuine interest. "May I see it?" As Isabel placed the shell in Elena's palm, something extraordinary happened. The shell began to warm and glow with a soft inner light, much like Henrik's warming stones, but gentler, more personal. Elena gasped as images suddenly filled her mind, visions of a young girl's pure joy as she discovered the wonders of the sea under her father's protective guidance. "You can see it too," Isabel whispered in amazement. "You can see my memories." "I can," Elena replied, wonder coloring her voice. "You have a gift, little one, the ability to infuse objects with emotional memory. It's very rare, very precious." She reached into the folds of her dress and withdrew a smooth river stone, no larger than a child's palm. "I have something similar, though mine was born of sorrow rather than joy. The stone was perfectly ordinary in appearance, grey and unremarkable, the kind found on any riverbank. But as Elena placed it in Isabel's small hands, it began to pulse with the same gentle warmth as the shell had done. "What do you see?" Elena asked softly. Isabel closed her eyes, and her young features grew peaceful. "I see a garden," she murmured. "There are roses, and a woman with golden hair is laughing. A man is pushing a little boy on a swing, and everyone is happy. It feels like sunshine and love." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "That was my sister's garden, Sarah's garden. The man was your father, but he was younger then and less afraid. The little boy was your brother, Michael, though you never had the chance to know him." I had a brother? Isabel's eyes snapped open, wide with wonder rather than sadness. You would have had a brother, Elena corrected gently, but the curse took him before you could be born. That's why this is so important, Isabel. You're not just your father's daughter. You're also the sister Michael never had the chance to meet, the hope that grew from the ashes of our family's sorrow. As they held the memory stone together, more visions flowed between them. Elena saw glimpses of Isabel's life aboard the Crimson Revenge, the love and protection that surrounded her, the way even hardened pirates became gentle in her presence. Isabel, in turn, witnessed moments from Elena's long vigil, the years of supernatural imprisonment that had taught her to see beyond the physical world into the realm of spirits and curses. You were alone for so long, Isabel said, her voice heavy with empathy beyond her years. But you never stopped hoping, did you? I couldn't, Elena replied. Hope was all I had, hope that someday I could return, that I could help your father find peace, that the curse could be broken before it claimed any more innocent lives. Their shared connection deepened as the day wore on. Elena taught Isabel about the subtle signs that preceded supernatural events, the way the air shimmered when ancient forces stirred, the manner in which ordinary objects could become conduits for extraordinary power. Isabel, in return, shared her understanding of her father's true nature, the gentle man who hid behind the fierce reputation of Captain Blackheart. He sings to me at night, Isabel confided, old songs from before he became a pirate. Sometimes he cries when he thinks I'm sleeping, and I know he's remembering people he loved who went away. He carries so much guilt, Elena said sadly. He blames himself for everything that happened, for every death the curse has caused since he began running. But guilt is just another form of love, Isabel. It means he cares so deeply that the loss nearly destroyed him. As the sun began to set, painting the medical quarters in warm golden light, an unusual phenomenon occurred. The memory stone in their joined hands began to glow more brightly, and suddenly the ship's broken compass in the captain's quarters started spinning in perfect synchronization with their heartbeats, as if their growing bond was creating a new kind of navigation system, one that pointed not toward earthly destinations but toward hope and healing. Another supernatural storm struck their hidden cove that night, but this tempest was unlike any natural weather the experienced sailors had ever witnessed. The wind howled with voices that spoke in languages older than memory, and the lightning struck in patterns that seemed deliberately arranged rather than randomly scattered. When dawn broke over the churning waters, the crew discovered that the storm had brought them another impossible gift. There on the beach, precisely where Elena had been found, lay an ancient tome bound in what appeared to be scales from some long-extinct sea creature. The book was massive, easily 2 feet tall and nearly as wide, its pages thick with age and sealed with clasps made of tarnished silver. Despite having been submerged in the violent waters, it showed no signs of damage from salt or moisture. Elena approached the grimoire with a mixture of reverence and dread, her supernatural senses immediately recognizing the dark power that emanated from its ancient pages. "This is Morwen's spell book," she told the assembled crew, her voice barely above a whisper, "the grimoire of binding curses. She used this to create the plague that destroyed your family, Magnus." Captain Blackheart stood several paces away, his weathered features reflecting the internal struggle between his desire to understand and his instinct to flee from anything connected to his past. "How can you be certain?" "Because I can hear her voice whispering from within it," Elena replied, her fingers tracing the strange symbols carved into the cover. "The book calls to those who have been touched by her magic. It wants to be read, wants its secrets revealed." Henrik shuffled closer, his healer's curiosity overcoming his natural caution. "Can you read the language?" Elena nodded slowly. "The text is written in Old Celtic, mixed with symbols from traditions that predate written history. I learned to read such things during my years of imprisonment, when I had nothing but time to study the forces that held me captive." As Elena carefully opened the grimoire, its pages seemed to glow with their own internal light. The text writhed and shifted like living things, making it difficult to focus on any single passage for long. But gradually, as Elena's eyes adjusted to the supernatural script, the words began to make horrible sense. "The curse is more complex than I initially understood," she said, her voice growing heavy with dread. "Morwen didn't simply create a plague to kill children. She designed a supernatural trap that would follow specific bloodlines across generations, growing stronger with each act of cowardice or abandonment by its targets." Isabel, who had been quietly listening from her father's side, stepped closer to Elena. "What does that mean?" Elena's eyes found the child's face, and her expression filled with sorrow. "It means the curse was specifically designed to test the courage of those eye teeth marks. Your father was supposed to face it 20 years ago, when it was young and relatively weak. By running, he gave it time to grow more powerful. But surely there must be a way to break it," Captain Blackheart said, though his voice carried little hope. Elena turned several pages, her finger following lines of text that seemed to burn with supernatural fire as she read them. "There is a way, but it requires perfect courage and absolute selflessness." She looked up at the captain, her storm-colored eyes reflecting the weight of terrible knowledge. "You must perform 3 acts of redemption, each one requiring you to face a part of your past you've been avoiding." "What kind of acts?" Sullivan asked, his broken necklace now hanging in pieces around his neck. "First, you must return to the place where your cowardice began and seek forgiveness from those you abandoned. Second, you must make a sacrifice that proves you value others' lives above your own. Third, you must face Morwen herself in the realm where she dwells, between the world of the living and the domain of the dead." The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore and the distant cry of seabirds. Captain Blackheart stared at the ancient book as if it were a venomous snake, understanding that it held both the key to salvation and the path to destruction. "And if I fail?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Elena's voice was barely audible as she read the final passage. "If you fail at any point, the curse will claim not only your life, but the lives of all those connected to you. It will spread beyond this crew, beyond this region, seeking out every descendant of every person who played a role in Morwen's banishment." She looked directly at Isabel. "The curse specifically targets the children of those it marks. If we cannot break it, your daughter will not live to see her next birthday, and neither will any other child who carries even a trace of the bloodlines Morwen cursed." The grimoire's pages suddenly slammed shut with a sound like thunder, as if the book had delivered its message, and would say no more until the time for action arrived. The journey to Port Royal took 3 days of hard sailing, during which Captain Blackheart prepared himself for the most difficult confrontation of his adult life. In the privacy of his quarters, he retrieved a small wooden box that had remained untouched for 20 years. Inside, wrapped in faded blue velvet, lay his naval officer's medal, awarded for distinguished service to the Crown. The bronze had tarnished to a dull green, and the ribbon had faded from deep blue to pale grey, but the inscription remained clear: Lieutenant Magnus Thorne, Valor and Honor. His hands trembled as he pinned the medal to his coat, feeling its weight like an anchor around his heart. The uniform no longer fit properly, his body having changed from a young officer's lean frame to a weathered pirate's broader shoulders, but wearing it felt like putting on the skin of a man he had murdered through cowardice. Elena had explained that each trial required him to face his failures honestly, without the protective armor of Captain Blackheart's reputation. He had to return as Magnus Thorne, the man who had abandoned his post and the families who depended on him when supernatural terror struck their peaceful town. Unknown to the captain, Isabel and Elena had made their own plans. As the Crimson Revenge anchored in Port Royal's bustling harbour, the 2 conspirators slipped ashore in a small boat, determined to provide support for the ordeal ahead. Elena's supernatural abilities allowed her to mask their presence, making them effectively invisible to casual observation while still allowing them to witness the captain's struggle. Port Royal had changed in 20 years, but not in ways that comforted the returning officer. Where once neat naval facilities had maintained order and purpose, Now ramshackle buildings housed merchants of questionable reputation. The town had grown larger but seedier, and the sight of his former headquarters now serving as a tavern struck Magnus like a physical blow. He made his way through familiar streets with leaden feet, each step taking him closer to a reckoning he had avoided for 2 decades. The first house he sought belonged to Mary Blackwood, widow of Sergeant William Blackwood, who had died trying to maintain order during the plague's worst days. Magnus remembered giving the order that sent William into the affected district, remembered the man's unflinching salute as he marched into danger. The woman who answered his knock was older, greyer, but her eyes still held the same gentle strength he remembered. When she recognized him, her face cycled through shock, anger, and finally a weary sadness. "Lieutenant Thorne," she said quietly, "I wondered if you would ever return." "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his voice cracking with emotion, "I've come to apologize, to try to explain why I left when you and the others needed me most." She invited him inside, where the small parlor was filled with memories of her lost husband. William's uniform hung in a place of honor, his service medals displayed with pride. The sight of them made Magnus acutely aware of how he had dishonored his own service through flight. "I was afraid," he said simply, the words cutting him like broken glass. "When the plague took my family, when I realized we were facing something supernatural, I broke. I ran because I couldn't bear to lose anyone else under my command." Mary Blackwood studied him for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "William wrote to me before he died," she said finally. "He understood why you left. He said a man can only carry so much loss before his spirit breaks." The conversation continued for an hour, with Magnus accepting responsibility for abandoning his duties and Mary gradually offering the forgiveness he had never dared hope for. As they spoke, he began to feel a subtle change, as if some invisible weight was lifting from his shoulders. From their hidden vantage point, Elena and Isabel watched the encounter with growing hope. The curse's hold was indeed weakening, though the change was so gradual as to be almost imperceptible. The pattern repeated throughout the day as Magnus visited other families, other widows, other children who had grown up without fathers because of orders he had given and responsibilities he had abandoned. Each conversation was a small agony, but also a step toward healing that had been postponed for far too long. By evening, when Magnus returned to the ship, his medal no longer felt like a burden. The bronze had begun to brighten, as if the act of wearing it honorably had restored some of its original luster. More importantly, the supernatural compass that had been spinning wildly since Elena's arrival now pointed steadily in a new direction, suggesting that the first trial had been successfully completed. But Elena's expression remained grave as she studied the ancient grimoire. 2 trials remained, and each would be more difficult than the last. Word of the supernatural threat spread through Port Royal's maritime community with startling speed. What Magnus had expected to be a series of private, painful encounters soon became something far more complex as former enemies and old rivals began seeking him out with stories of their own. The first unexpected visitor arrived at dawn, when Captain Eduardo Santana of the Spanish merchant fleet knocked on Magnus's cabin door aboard the Crimson Revenge. Santana was a man Magnus had pursued relentlessly during his naval days, a smuggler whose activities had cost the Crown considerable revenue. They had fought 3 sea battles, and Magnus had always assumed their enmity was permanent. "Lieutenant Thorne," Santana said formally, his weathered face grave with concern, "I come under a flag of truce. We need to talk about the children." Magnus gestured for the Spanish captain to enter, puzzled by the man's serious demeanor. Santana was typically jovial, even when conducting illegal business, but today he carried himself like a man bearing terrible news. "My nephew, Carlos Santana, began without preamble. He lives in Cartagena with my sister's family. 3 weeks ago, he fell ill with a fever that the doctors cannot explain. He speaks of dark dreams, of shadows that whisper his name. The symptoms match what your mysterious woman described." Magnus felt his blood run cold. Cartagena was hundreds of miles from their current location, far from any place he had directly visited. Yet if the curse was spreading that far, it meant Elena's warnings about the supernatural plague's expanding reach were proving true. "There are others," Santana continued. "Captain Morrison of the English Trading Company lost his daughter last month to the same symptoms. Captain de Silva's grandson in Havana. All children, all struck by the same unexplainable illness." He leaned forward intently. "We may have been enemies, Thorne, but we are also fathers and uncles. If you know how to stop this thing, we need to work together." Before Magnus could respond, another knock interrupted them. Sullivan entered with news that more captains were arriving, all with similar stories of sick children and supernatural symptoms affecting their families. By mid-morning, the small harbour held an unprecedented gathering of former enemies united by shared terror for their loved ones. Elena emerged from the medical quarters, her supernatural senses allowing her to perceive the growing desperation among the assembled sea captains. "The curse is accelerating," she told Magnus quietly. "Your first trial weakened its hold on you personally, but that seems to have caused it to spread more aggressively among those connected to you through past conflicts." The meeting that followed took place on the beach, with more than a dozen captains forming a circle around Elena and Magnus. These were hardened men who had spent their lives competing for territory, treasure, and trade routes. Yet they listened with the quiet attention of students as Elena explained the supernatural forces they faced. "This is beyond any of our individual capabilities," said Captain Morrison, a thin Englishman whose usual arrogance had been replaced by humble desperation. "My trading company has resources, connections in every major port. If you need supplies, information, or transportation, you have it." Captain de Silva, a fierce Portuguese corsair who had been Magnus's bitter rival for years, reached into his coat and withdrew a simple gold band. "This was my father's wedding ring," he said, offering it to Magnus. "He taught me that when facing true evil, old enemies must become brothers." He slipped the ring onto Magnus's finger. "Whatever you need, wherever this fight takes you, you have my sword and my ship." One by one, the other captains stepped forward with similar offerings. Not treasure or weapons, but symbols of trust and alliance. A compass from Captain Chen of the Chinese merchant fleet, a dagger from Captain O'Brien of the Irish smugglers. Each gift represented the transformation of former enmity into desperate cooperation. Elena watched these proceedings with growing amazement. "This is unexpected," she whispered to Magnus. "The curse feeds on isolation, on the guilt and fear of individuals fighting alone, but you're creating something it was never designed to counter, voluntary unity among former enemies." Isabel, who had been quietly observing from her father's side, suddenly spoke up. "It's like my shell collection," she said with the simple wisdom of childhood. "Each shell is beautiful by itself, but together they make something even more special." As the alliance formed around them, Magnus felt another shift in the supernatural forces at work. The alliance ring on his finger grew warm, and the broken compass at his belt spun toward a new heading. Elena consulted the grimoire and discovered that their unexpected unity had indeed affected the curse's structure. "The second trial may be easier now," she said with cautious hope. "When former enemies choose to stand together, they create a kind of spiritual strength that transcends individual courage." But even as she spoke, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the sea itself seemed to whisper warnings of greater challenges ahead. Elena stood at the bow of the Crimson Revenge as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, her storm-colored eyes fixed on a point in the distance that appeared empty to everyone else aboard. In her hands, she held an object that defied rational explanation, a key that seemed to exist only when moonlight touched it, flickering in and out of visibility like a mirage made of silver and shadow. "There," she said, pointing toward what looked like open ocean. "Morwen's stronghold lies just beyond the veil of the living world, anchored to reality at the place where she first called forth her curse." Captain Magnus studied the apparently empty waters through his spyglass, seeing nothing but gentle waves reflecting the dying sunlight. Yet his supernatural compass spun wildly whenever he pointed it in the direction Elena indicated, suggesting that something powerful indeed lay hidden there. "How do we reach a place that doesn't fully exist in our world?" asked Captain de Silva, who had brought his fastest ship alongside the Crimson Revenge to support their supernatural mission. Elena lifted the phantom key, allowing the last rays of sunlight to pass through its translucent form. This key was forged from Morwen's own tears of rage, crystallized at the moment she first spoke her curse. It can only unlock the path to her domain during the time between day and night, when the boundary between worlds grows thin. As if summoned by her words, the moon began to rise on the opposite horizon, still pale and ghostly in the twilight sky. The moment its light touched the phantom key, the artifact solidified into gleaming silver, and the empty ocean before them began to shimmer and change. A structure materialized in the distance, rising from the waves like a cathedral made of crystallized sorrow. The stronghold was neither fully solid nor entirely ethereal, but something between the two states, its towers reaching toward the sky while its foundations disappeared into supernatural depths that had nothing to do with the physical ocean floor. "It's beautiful," Isabel whispered in wonder, and indeed, despite its dark purpose, Morwen's stronghold possessed an otherworldly elegance that took the breath away. "Beautiful and deadly," Elena warned. "The stronghold exists in the realm between life and death. Ordinary mortals who enter it risk being trapped forever, caught between worlds like I was for 20 years. Then perhaps the child should remain here, where she'll be safe," suggested Captain Morrison, his paternal instincts clearly troubled by the idea of bringing Isabel into such danger. But Isabel stepped forward with determination that surprised everyone. "I'm not staying behind," she declared, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed beyond her years. "Papa needs me, and Elena needs me, and I think maybe the witch needs me too." Elena knelt before the child, studying her with eyes that could see far more than the physical world. "You understand the danger, don't you? In that place you could be lost forever." The chain began to disintegrate link by link, each broken connection releasing the spirit of a child who had died under the curse's influence. These ghostly figures appeared briefly in the chamber, not as accusers or tormentors, but as messengers of forgiveness, showing Morwen that even in death, innocence held no hatred for her. "They understand," Morwen whispered in amazement. "The children understand that I was acting from pain, not evil. They forgive me." As the supernatural bonds continued to crumble, the very fabric of the stronghold began to shake and shift. The realm between worlds was collapsing as the force that had created and sustained it finally found peace. Ancient walls became translucent, revealing glimpses of the natural world beyond. "We need to leave," Elena urged, but her voice held triumph rather than fear. "The stronghold is returning to the natural order. Morwen's spirit is free to move on, and we need to return to our own world." The allied captains, who had stood silent witness to these supernatural proceedings, began moving toward what had once been the chamber's door but now appeared as a gateway of pure sunlight. Through it, they could see their ships floating peacefully on normal ocean waters under a sky that promised dawn. But before they left, Morwen approached Magnus one final time. Her form was already becoming translucent as her spirit prepared to depart for whatever realm awaited those who had found redemption. "The curse is broken," she said, her voice now carrying peace instead of pain. "Your children are safe, all of them, everywhere the plague touched. But remember this lesson, Magnus Thorn. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing love despite fear, choosing forgiveness despite hurt." As they stepped through the gateway of light, the last link of the chain of sorrows shattered with a sound like music, its destruction sending waves of healing energy rippling across the supernatural realm and into the natural world beyond. Behind them, Morwen's laughter followed them home, no longer the bitter sound of vengeance, but the joyful music of a spirit finally free to rest. The stronghold collapsed into sparkling mist that was caught by morning winds and scattered across the Caribbean like blessings made manifest. On distant shores, in coastal towns across the region, children who had been wasting away from supernatural illness suddenly opened their eyes and asked for food, their fevers broken and their spirits restored by the healing power of forgiveness, freely given and gratefully received. The return to the natural world was like awakening from a dream that had lasted for decades. As the gateway of light closed behind them, Magnus felt the familiar weight of his physical body returning, along with the solid certainty that their feet once again stood on deck planks that obeyed normal laws of physics. The morning sun painted the Caribbean waters in shades of gold and turquoise that seemed impossibly vibrant after their journey through the supernatural realm. But the most remarkable change was in his compass. The ancient instrument that had been broken for 20 years now spun with purposeful precision before settling on a heading that pointed, not toward magnetic north, but toward something far more meaningful, home. Not the geographical location where they had anchored their ship, but the spiritual destination where hearts could finally rest in peace. Elena stood beside him at the rail, her supernatural imprisonment finally ended, her long vigil complete. The years of waiting had left their mark on her spirit, but she no longer carried the desperate urgency that had driven her since awakening on the beach. Instead, there was a profound calm about her, the peace of someone who had completed a task that had given meaning to decades of suffering. The children, Captain Santana called from his nearby vessel, his voice tight with anxious hope. "Has it worked? Are they truly safe?" Elena closed her eyes and extended her supernatural senses across the Caribbean, reaching out to touch the lives that had been threatened by Morwen's curse. What she felt made her smile with genuine joy for the first time in 20 years. "They're healing," she reported, her voice carrying across the water to all the assembled ships. "In Cartagena, in Havana, in Port Royal and beyond, the fever is breaking everywhere. Children who were dying are asking for food and water. Parents who had given up hope are crying tears of relief." A cheer went up from the Allied fleet, hardened sailors and cutthroat captains celebrating like schoolchildren as news of their success spread from ship to ship. Men who had been enemies for years embraced like brothers, their old rivalries forgotten in the face of shared triumph over supernatural evil. But for Magnus, the greatest joy came from watching his daughter's face as she processed what they had accomplished together. Isabel stood at the bow of the Crimson Revenge, her coral shell collection spread before her as she carefully added new specimens she had somehow gathered during their supernatural journey. Each shell now glowed with its own gentle light, as if her passage through the realm between worlds had awakened dormant magical properties in her treasures. "Papa," she said thoughtfully, "Elena doesn't have to be sad anymore, does she? And the witch lady found her way home too." "That's right, little one," Magnus replied, kneeling beside his remarkable daughter. "Sometimes the most important journeys aren't to new places, but back to parts of ourselves we thought we had lost forever." The crew of the Crimson Revenge had been transformed by their experience as much as their captain had. Sullivan's Kraken's tooth necklace had somehow been restored during their supernatural adventure, the ivory fang now gleaming white and whole. Henrik's warming stones had acquired new powers, capable of healing not just physical ailments, but emotional wounds as well. Even the newest crew members carried themselves with the dignity of men who had faced ultimate evil and emerged victorious. As the Allied fleet began to separate, each captain returning to his own waters and responsibilities, the bonds they had forged in supernatural fire remained strong. They exchanged signal flags and established codes for future communication, understanding that their alliance had created something more valuable than any treasure, a network of former enemies united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Captain De Silva was among the last to depart, sailing close enough to the Crimson Revenge for final words. "The Alliance Ring," he called, pointing to the golden band that still encircled Magnus's finger. "Keep it as a reminder that some friendships are forged in places darker than any ocean depth." Elena found her place aboard the Crimson Revenge with surprising ease, as if she had always been meant to be part of their strange family. The crew accepted her with the same protective affection they had always shown Isabel, understanding instinctively that she was someone who had earned her place through sacrifice and courage. As Port Royal appeared on the horizon, Magnus realized that he was no longer running from his past or toward an uncertain future. The new dawn compass pointed steadily toward a destination that was both geographical and spiritual, a life where Captain Blackheart and Lieutenant Magnus Thorne could finally coexist in peace. The curse was broken. The children were safe, and for the first time in 20 years, Magnus Thorne could look toward tomorrow without fear clouding his vision. He was going home, not to a place, but to a version of himself that honor and love had finally restored. 6 months later, the same beach where Elena had first appeared from her icy prison had been transformed into something that would have seemed impossible during the dark days of the curse. Children's laughter echoed across the pristine sand as the families of the Allied captains gathered for what had become a regular celebration of life, healing, and the bonds forged in supernatural fire. Isabel sat at the water's edge, her coral shell collection now numbering in the hundreds, each piece carefully catalogued and arranged according to mysteries only she understood. But today she was adding something special to her treasures, a new locket that Elena had crafted for her, containing miniature portraits of their expanded family. The locket was made from the same crystalline material as Elena's pendant, but it glowed with warm golden light instead of supernatural silver. "Tell me again about the lady in the ice," called 6-year-old Carlos Santana, nephew to Captain Eduardo and one of the many children whose lives had been saved when the curse was broken. He and a dozen other young ones had formed an informal circle around Isabel, drawn by her gift for storytelling and her collection of wonders. Isabel smiled, her young wisdom enriched by experiences that would have challenged adults twice her age. "Well," she began, settling the new locket carefully among her other treasures, "once upon a time there was a woman who loved her family so much that she slept in ice for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to save all the children in the world." As her story unfolded, painting Elena's sacrifice in terms that young minds could understand and celebrate, Magnus and Elena themselves walked slowly along the shoreline. The former pirate captain had traded his black flag for a letter of marque from the crown, transforming the Crimson Revenge from a pirate vessel into a legitimate guardian of Caribbean shipping lanes. It was honest work that allowed him to use his skills for protection rather than plunder. "Any regrets?" Elena asked as they paused to watch Isabel enchanting her young audience. Magnus considered the question carefully. About becoming Magnus Thorne again? About giving up the freedom of piracy? No regrets at all. He touched the new dawn compass at his belt, which now pointed steadily toward whatever destination would most benefit those under his protection. "I spent 20 years running from responsibility. Now I understand that real freedom comes from choosing what to protect rather than what to take." Elena had found her own place in their transformed world, serving as healer and counselor to the Allied fleet, using her supernatural experience to help others navigate the mysteries that still occasionally surfaced in Caribbean waters. Her years of imprisonment had taught her patience and wisdom that proved invaluable in her new role as protector of the innocent. "Look, Papa!" Isabel called suddenly, pointing toward something half buried in the sand near her feet. "There's something else the tide brought in." Magnus and Elena hurried over to find Isabel carefully excavating what appeared to be an ornate bottle, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change in the afternoon sunlight. Inside, they could see what looked like a rolled parchment, and the bottle itself radiated the unmistakable signature of supernatural significance. "Well," Magnus said with a chuckle that held no fear, only anticipation, "it seems the sea has another mystery for us to solve." Isabel grinned up at him with the fearless enthusiasm that had helped heal an ancient curse and transform enemies into family. "Should we open it, Papa? Should we see what new adventure is waiting for us?" As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the peaceful scene in shades of gold and promise, Magnus realized that some questions answered themselves. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of ancient grief, something worth protecting and nurturing for generations to come. And if the sea chose to bring them new mysteries to solve, well, they would face them together, as a family strengthened by love and tested by forces that had ultimately made them stronger.